My name is James Knox, and I am chairman of the Scottish Boswell Book Festival, which is in alliance with Lucia Della Porta with the lovely Pisa Book Festival. So this is a Scottish-Italian unification, and it's very exciting for us. And Lucia came to our festival in the spring, and she heard Matthew speak about his wonderful book on Oscar Wilde, which I know you will find enthralling. Do you need me to say anything else, Lucia? No. Anyway, we'd like to thank you, Lucia, very, very much indeed for letting us come here, and it's totally wonderful. And Oscar Wilde would completely approve that we're here today. Thank you very much. A big round of applause for Matthew.
Thank you, James. And I sometimes feel I should apologize, really, for writing another book about Oscar Wilde. He is, after all, someone who has been much written about. Every year, it seems, produces one or two publications about the great man. In recent times, we've had books about his reading, his sex life, his medical history. We've had an account of his love of Paris and of his knowledge of Greek. There's even been an entire book dedicated to his seaside holiday at Worthing during the summer of 1894. But what there hasn't really been, and for a very long time, is a full account of his life from the cradle to the grave. It wasn't a very long life. He was born in 1854. He died in 1900, aged just 46. But it was a life crowded with incident. And really the last proper attempt to give the full span of that life was back in the late 1980s, a wonderful book written by an American professor of English literature called Richard Ellman. But perhaps inevitably, in the intervening years since then, those 3 decades, an enormous amount of interesting new material has come to light. New documents, new letters, dozens, hundreds of new letters, new manuscripts, and much of it absolutely core, fascinating stuff. In the year 2000, a woman arrived at the British Library with a carrier bag containing the complete transcript of Wilde's trial against the Marquis of Queensberry, the libel action he brought against the Marquis of Queensberry, which had previously only been known from abbreviated court reports and newspaper articles. There was also discovered in the back of a drawer at a solicitor's office all the witness statements from that same trial. On top of those remarkable discoveries, there have been, of course, new ways of researching historic figures that have come to the fore in recent times. Most significantly, of course, is the extraordinary expansion of the internet, and perhaps its most telling point in terms of researching a historical figure from the late 19th century is the enormous project to digitize the historic archives of old newspapers. I'm sure many of you have done research in the past where you've needed to consult old periodicals and can vividly recall turning the pages of those sort of huge bound volumes of some old newspaper and your eyes scanning down it, searching for the name of the person that you're interested in, or that even worse moment when you arrive at the desk of the newspaper library and they tell you that the particular publication you're after has been transferred to microfilm. And then you have to battle to put the film into the machine, and you turn slowly through the pages. And as they spin before you on the lighted screen, you begin to wonder whether the pages are moving, the screen is moving, the room is moving, or perhaps you are moving. And all the time your eye is straining to find the name of Oscar Wilde or Aubrey Beardsley or whoever you might be interested in. Now, of course, that is completely changed, and there is this miraculous thing that you can simply type the name of the person you're looking to into the search engine, and suddenly dozens, if not hundreds, of references spring to light before you. Of course, that creates its own problems and its own challenges. but it is a remarkable innovation, and certainly through that I was able to add enormously to the richness and texture of Wilde's life. But in the intervening 30 years, I think also it would be true to say that Oscar Wilde himself has risen in status. He seems to have become more present in our lives, a more important and necessary figure. His roles as an artist, a sexual heretic, a political subversive, a precursor in many ways of celebrity culture, have all conspired to make him seem a very vital and real person in the 21st century. I mean, just last year in London, for the whole year, one of the theatres on the Strand ran a season of his plays. They worked through his entire oeuvre over the course of the 12 months. An extraordinary achievement for any 19th century playwright to have that accolade and to sustain it so well. His books are still read. They're turned into films. He himself appears as a character in films. I mean, most recently in the wonderful film The Happy Prince, directed and starring Rupert Everett. He even appears in a series of detective books written by a British author, Giles Brandreth, which is an accolade in itself. And I suppose perhaps what keeps him most present in the cultural flux of the moment is his wonderful treasure trove of epigrams and aperçus. They seem constantly current, constantly fresh, and constantly about us. I mean, it's very hard to walk past an Irish-themed pub without seeing a chalkboard proclaiming that work is the curse of the drinking classes, or to walk across a university campus without seeing somebody sporting a T-shirt saying genius is born, not paid. And this fame and currency of his epigrams is not something new at all. It was something that was very present during his own life and his own lifetime. And I thought perhaps it would be an interesting way to cut into his life, because as you can see from the scale of my volume, it might not be possible to follow it in detail through all its curves in the space of a single hour. But as a way of dipping into it at different ways, I thought if we perhaps took 6 or 7 of his epigrams and looked at them in context, we would get a sense of Oscar and his achievement. Now, I must remember to press this. Undoubtedly, the first thing that he said that achieved a wide currency was a line that he spun while he was an undergraduate at Oxford. Every day, I find it harder and harder to live up to my blue china. Now, this was a witty distillation of an idea that was current at the time, a expression of a new feeling for what was called aestheticism. It was a movement that grew out of the work of the pre-Raphaelite painters and their immediate heirs, and also from the teachings of John Ruskin, the great art critic and artist as well and writer of that period. An idea that art was absolutely central to existence, and that also that it had a sort of moral force, that truth and beauty were petals of the same flower, essentially, and that they would find their best and greatest expression through art. Now, Wilde was enormously excited when he encountered this idea. As a young man, he'd been born and brought up in Dublin. He'd gone to school in Dublin. He'd begun his university career at Trinity College Dublin. But then before completing his degree, he transferred to Oxford and really re-began his degree in classics at Magdalen College, Oxford. He was lit up by the beauty of Oxford itself, but lit up even more by the lectures of Ruskin that he attended at the university. Ruskin at that time was the Slade Professor of Art at Oxford. And he gave a wonderful course of lectures on early Renaissance Italian art. Wilde attended religiously, and for him it threw open the doors on this amazing vista of art and beauty standing at the very center of existence. He embraced the concept with enthusiasm. And he embraced the particular aspects, the signifiers of that movement, which really, I suppose, distilled themselves in the works of the pre-Raphaelites, particularly Dante Gabriel Rossetti and his disciples Edward Burne-Jones and William Morris. Not only their own art and the beautiful house that Morris created with their assistants at Red Hill, the Red House just outside London, but also in this cultural eclecticism that was part of their vision. It was a world that wanted to combine William Morris's own wallpapers and fabrics with Turkish carpets or Moorish metalwork, and little Greek Tanagra figures. And perhaps most importantly, the key element in that eclectic cultural equation was blue and white china from Japan and the East generally, which had previously been very little known in the artistic circles in Britain, but was just being discovered with the opening up of Japan at that time. And there was a huge vogue and fad for it, and Wilde embraced it with enthusiasm. And he decorated his rooms in Magdalen. During his last year, he had a beautiful set of rooms, and he put wonderful rugs down on the carpet. He gilded the ceiling, which he thought would make it look spectacular. He had Morris wallpapers, and he made a collection of blue and white china. And then this notion that beauty had this moral force, he fixed in this delightful phrase, which of course is tellingly Wildean in the way that it took a complex idea, he made it succinct, and he made it amusing. He, throughout his life, although he espoused numerous serious causes, he had a sort of ever bubbling up Irish wit inside him, which found it impossible to avoid the pleasures of comedy. And he realized that comedy was the great, and humor was the great agent of communication. So he made this statement, which rapidly became repeated across the university. It was disapproved of by some. It was said that there was even a sermon preached against it in the university church because it thought it might lead people astray, and if we were setting up art as a new and parallel religion. But it certainly served to bring Oscar to a new and a special prominence at the beginning of his career and at the end of his time at university. Which brings us to our next quotation. Both of Henry Irving's legs are distinctly precious, but his left leg is a poem. Now, Henry Irving, as I'm not sure you all know, was the great actor or actor-manager of late 19th century London. He ran a famous theatre at the Lyceum with his leading lady, Ellen Terry. And it was the great hub of dramatic art and dramatic experiment, really, at that time. Wilde came to London having achieved a brilliant degree at Oxford, with really a desire to make his way as a literary figure in the English capital. But more than that, as he said to two friends when they were discussing what they wanted to do with their future lives, and his two contemporaries had described their sort of mundane ambitions to working in a solicitor's office in Bristol or running an estate in Scotland. Wilde said, well, he wanted to be a writer, but more than that, he wanted to be famous, and if not famous, notorious. Now, this was an extraordinary vision. It was something new in the world, and Wilde was really amazingly prescient and clear-sighted in grasping the possibility that fame could be achieved almost on its own account. In a sense, it was a product of the moment, of the time. At that late 19th century period, there'd been an enormous proliferation in the print media of that time. Universal education had come in a generation before, and there were many, many more people who could read and wanted to read, and they wanted to read magazines and newspapers. And throughout the late 1870s, early 1880s, a plethora of new papers and periodicals appeared on the scene. And Wilde perceived that all these papers and magazines needed to be filled with material, but also beyond that, they were beginning to require a new sort of material. They didn't want the mere cataloguing of facts and information. They wanted the colour and spice of personality. And Wilde saw an opportunity, really, for himself to become the personal embodiment of aestheticism. The great figures of the age, the artists and poets who had created it, Rossetti, Burne-Jones, Morris, Swinburne, and Ruskin, of course, as well, were all getting on in years. They were all shy and retiring figures. They all really had a horror of the vulgarity, as they saw it, of the new print media. But Wilde was young, he was not afraid of vulgarity, he found it exciting in a way, and he was eager to embrace this opportunity. And in this, he was assisted by the fact that his brother, he had his elder brother, Willie, who was just 18 months his senior, had come over from Dublin to London at almost the same time that Oscar arrived. He'd abandoned a legal career and begun working in journalism for several of these new magazines that had been started up. And he was officious in reporting things that Oscar said and did when he arrived in London. So this quotation was something that Oscar had said, and Willie made sure that it appeared in the newspapers. And of course, the way that the press works then, as it works now, is once one newspaper reports it, other papers pick it up, and it begins to spread out in a slow diffusion of time. So Wilde wanted to make his reputation by stating extreme aesthetic positions. He realized that that art could not merely be extended, from the painted picture on a wall into home decoration, but in fact into every aspect of life and experience. So tales were soon being told of him of how, when he fell ill, he went to his local pharmacy, and the pharmacist said, well, you must take these pills to they'll set you right in no time. And Oscar said, oh, well, I don't like the look of those pills. They're brown. What about those beautiful golden pills over there? I'd much rather have them. They're so beautiful, I'm sure that they would make me better instead. And this quotation is part of that campaign. He was taking the presence of a great actor who was normally criticized in terms of his acting, and instead describing his legs and transmuting the criticism of his legs into the realm of art, and calling his left leg a poem. And of course, it's also significant that he was talking about Henry Irving, one of the most famous people in London at that time. Wilde perceived as well, right at the outset, that there was a huge value in the dynamics of connection. So he would talk about Henry Irving. He would write poems about Ellen Terry. His literary output during his first 2 years in London was really very, very meagre. He wrote a handful of poems for some of these magazines that his elder brother Willie was working for. And almost invariably, they're poems about celebrated actresses. He wrote about not only about Ellen Terry, but about Sarah Bernhardt and Lily Langtry, the great beauty of that period. And these were people much more celebrated than he was, and so his poem caught the reflected glory of their name. And it was a remarkably successful strategy. Within 2 years of arriving in London, 1880 and 1881, Wilde could boast that he was the most paragraphed man in London outside of politicians and murderers. But although he had achieved this remarkable celebrity, it was very hard for him to monetize it, as we would say now, to actually make a living from his fame. And so the great question arose as to how this could be done, which brings us to our next quotation. "I have nothing to declare except my genius." Now, this is what Oscar said, or was reported to have said, when he arrived in America at the beginning of 1882 to carry out a lecture tour. It was decided that, that really that would be the best way for Oscar to earn money. He'd hoped that his rising fame would actually further his immediate literary ambitions. He'd written a play, a 4-act melodrama about Russian nihilists called Vera, but he found that even his celebrity, great as it was not sufficient to tempt any producer to actually put it on. By the same token, he'd produced a small volume of poems, but no publisher really wanted to invest the money in publishing that. In the end, Oscar paid for its publication and brought it out on his own account. He had a meeting with various of his friends as to what could be done for the furtherance of Oscar's future. There was one suggestion that he might go onto the stage, but he felt that he didn't really want to become an actor. He'd rather say his own lines than other people's. There was a thought, because he was such an advocate of the beauty of flowers as part of his aesthetic campaign, that perhaps he ought to open a market garden and sell sunflowers, because he'd done so much to popularize the bloom. But he felt he couldn't really face any occupation that would involve him having to wear boots. And there was even an unhelpful suggestion from one military friend that he should join the army for a couple of years and recruit his resources that way. But much more alluring was the notion of a lecture tour. And at that time, there was a well-established circuit of lecture venues, certainly across the east coast of America. And Wilde's contacts were able to put him together with an amazing impresario called Richard D'Oyley Carte, who was very keen to take Oscar as this popular embodiment of aestheticism to America to lecture. Part of his eagerness for that was that his main business was promoting the opera duo Gilbert and Sullivan. And Gilbert and Sullivan had recently created a wonderful opera called Patience, which was a satire of aestheticism. It was full of wonderful tunes, and it had just opened in America, in New York, and the New York audiences were enjoying it enormously. But essentially, they didn't know what aestheticism was. They were bemused by the subject being satirized. And D'Oyley Carte saw that there was a real opportunity. If Wilde went out and lectured on aestheticism, it would inform an American audience about the subject. And of course, interest in Wilde would be stimulated by the opera, so there would be a useful synergy. And indeed, so it turned out. Wilde arrived in the States and delivered his first lecture in New York, and it was a huge success, and led from there to other lectures across the continent. In parenthesis, though, we should pause to look again at this quotation, because certainly one of the surprises, if not shocks, of the book was to find out that although this line, one of the most famous of Wildean quotes, has echoed through the ages, there is no evidence at all that he actually said it when he arrived in America at the beginning of 1882. And indeed, much to suggest that he didn't say it, because his arrival is very, very fully documented. It makes its first appearance in a book written in 1912, 12 years after Wilde's death, a book by Arthur Ransom, which was a study of Wilde's life and writings. And I think was probably a pious invention of Wilde's friend Robbie Ross, who helped Ransom with the biographical details. The line of Wilde's that achieved the greatest notoriety at the time when he came to America was one garnered by the reporters who rushed to meet him when his ship docked in New York. Richard D'Oyly Cart's agent in America had worked tirelessly beforehand to whip up interest in Wilde before his arrival. And a group of reporters actually rowed out to the boat as it was waiting in the lanes outside New York Harbor to interview him. And in amongst the barrage of questions, what are you going to lecture about? What is aestheticism? What do you think of America? I mean, he hadn't even arrived at that stage. They fortunately hit upon the fact that gleaned from one of the other passengers on board the ship that during the course of the crossing, Wilde had been walking on the deck with this other passenger and had remarked that he was disappointed in the Atlantic Ocean. It was a very calm crossing. There were no storms at all, and as Wilde said, the mighty ocean did not roar. Anyway, this line that Wilde was disappointed in the Atlantic Ocean was reported in the next day's newspapers across New York. It was rapidly telegraphed to the other side of the disappointing ocean and was reported in the English papers, and really became the great soundbite of his American tour. There were soon there were articles being written about whether the Atlantic Ocean had been disappointed in Oscar Wilde, and disses written about it. And really every moment of his year-long stay in America, whenever he encountered some new phenomenon, he would be asked whether it was more or less disappointing than the Atlantic Ocean. The Niagara Falls, I think, fell as low in his estimate as the Atlantic. He thought it was very disappointing, a vast mass of unnecessary water going the wrong way and then falling over some rocks was how he described it. And he thought it very unfair that all American women were taken there on their honeymoon. But then he said it must be the first, if not the keenest, disappointment of married life for them. The year-long stay in America had an enormous effect on Wilde. I mean, it increased his celebrity tenfold. He became really an international, global name in many ways. And it seemed that it might, at last, the fame might give him the artistic opportunities that he hoped it would. He found an actress who was eager and ready to put on Vera, the melodrama about Russian nihilists. Unfortunately, when it was mounted in New York, in fact the following year in 1883, events conspired to make it an appalling failure. The New York critics, who were always very extreme in their views, instead of leaping to its praise, panned it as contentious, ill thought out, and uneven. And it was an appalling blow. The show didn't even last out the week, and Wilde felt really the awful shock of failure, something he'd not encountered in his life before then, and he'd put such sort of hopes and expectations into this vision of himself becoming a dramatist, and they were absolutely crushed by the defeat of his play Vera in New York. So he returned to Britain chastened in many ways, but determined to persevere as best he could. Which brings us to our next line. He found really the way forward most unclear. The artistic opportunities seem to have closed down around him. Certainly no one was interested in putting on another play by him. But he thought he could build upon the success of his lectures. So he continued lecturing in England, less on aestheticism and more on practical matters, on home decoration and on dress reform. And he really became a sort of adept on both those fronts. And in that sort of moment, in the early to mid-80s, the most celebrated thing he said was a remark to a society hostess who had recently bought some Japanese screens, and she invited him round and asked him, Oscar, where should I put the screens? How should I arrange them? And he said, don't arrange them, just let them occur. And although it was a celebrated remark in its way, it sort of fixed his position as this sort of arbiter of taste in the drawing rooms of society London. His own position in London shifted slightly. He married a beautiful and wealthy young Dublin girl who his family had known for ages, called Constance Lloyd. They bought, really with her money, a beautiful house in Tite Street, which they did up along the lines that he talked about and discussed in his lectures. They had beautiful screens and they let them occur where they would. And in quick succession, he had two children, two sons. He then, amazingly, was able to stop his lecturing and his book reviewing, which he'd taken on, when he was offered a job editing the Woman's World magazine. And it was a thrilling thing for him in a way to have a regular income for the first time in his life. And he loved being in that world of women as well. Women had always been his great advocates and his great champions in London social life. Luckily, London, like all good societies, is run by women. And he was able to repay their kindness and their interest through this magazine by working with them, getting them to write for his periodical. But there's no doubt that he felt a world of convention closing in on him. He had a proper job, he had a house with a mortgage, he had 2 children, he had his wife. This vision of himself as an artistic outsider seemed compromised and increasingly distant. Which takes us to our next line, which is, there is no such thing as a moral or an immoral book. Books are either well written or badly written. Now, this was the line that he span in defense of his one novel that he wrote, The Picture of Dorian Gray. Now, in this book, he really opens up a new cultural vision. He has moved on, clearly, from that Ruskinian idea where art and morality are connected to a credo where art is entirely unconnected with morality, that art exists only for its own sake, and that the sensual enjoyment and expression of beauty is the single important element of artistic endeavour. And that in the realms of what art can take on and express, everything is now possible. It's not a question of capturing natural beauty in a particularly expressive way. You can search out ugliness and through art transmute it. You can take on corruption and sin and perversity. And Wilde embraced these ideas, which essentially had come from the French decadents whom he'd encountered in Paris, initially during his honeymoon, but in the years afterwards as well, on his frequent trips to the French capital. And this Wilde had found an increasingly stimulating and exciting idea. And in his novel, the world that Dorian Gray explores once he has the portrait safely up in the attic is a world of corruption and sin, perversion and depravity, but expressed with a relish and excitement by Wilde that the critics found alarming. So even though nominally Dorian Gray seems to get his comeuppance at the end of the piece, there was a feeling that Wilde's relish in writing about the subject somehow compromised that moral and made both the book and Wilde suspect. Well, certainly the shift in Wilde's credo matched a shift in the circumstances of his own life. Towards the end of the 1880s, probably at the end of 1886 or 1887, he had his first homosexual experience. He was seduced, as we now think, by a young friend of the family called Robbie Ross, and who, although only 17 at the time, had a sort of frank acceptance of his own sexual nature. And this seduction came as an amazing revelation to Wilde. It obviously was an acknowledgement of something that had existed in his own nature always, probably. But it was an acknowledgement, and it came obviously as a great sexual excitement, but also it had other aspects as well. I mean, it changed his position within society and his own social arrangements, I mean, because he was not only betraying Constance, he was standing outside the law. At that time, homosexuality was illegal, and indeed had just been made in a way more illegal by the passing of the Criminal Law Amendment Act in 1885, which made all sexual contact between men outside the law. And so it set Wilde against society in a way that he found exciting and stimulating. It also linked him with the Greek tradition of pederasty, which was something that had fascinated him since his university days. It was a strain of classical life and thought that had been really submerged for generations. Scholarship had willfully decided to ignore it and indeed to cover it up. But really, at the very moment that Wilde was at university, scholars, and by chance, these were scholars who were Wilde's tutors and friends when he was at Trinity and at Oxford, were beginning to confront and to examine the tradition, which finds perhaps its clearest expression, of course, in Plato's Symposium. And I don't know if you recall there how Socrates describes the vision of, if you want to create a beautiful person as a Greek man, you should find a beautiful woman and you can have a beautiful baby. But if you want to create a beautiful work of art, you should find a beautiful youth, and your love for that youth will inspire a wonderful creative endeavor. And this was an idea that had percolated in Wilde's mind. He thought it extraordinary when he'd first encountered it. And now, through his own life and his own actions, he found himself in alignment with it. And I think it certainly did play into his excitement with his new sexual life. And there is no doubt that, in the period after that first seduction by Robbie Ross, it was the years immediately after that that saw the great fluorescence of his creativity. It was then that he wrote his two duologues, The Decay of Lying and The Critic as Artist. He wrote The Picture of Dorian Gray, some of his great stories, and then his four wonderful social comedies, Lady Windermere's Fan, A Woman of No Importance, An Ideal Husband, and lastly, the great farce, The Importance of Being Earnest. But it was a world and a life that also had its very dangerous side. And that brings us to our next line. Did you ever kiss him? No, Never on my life. He was a peculiarly plain boy. Now, this was a fatal line that Wilde spoke when standing in the witness box in the Old Bailey under cross-examination during a trial, a legal action that he had brought, a libel action against the Marquis of Queensberry. Now, in 1892, just after the success of Lady Windermere's Fan, Wilde's first great moment of theatrical success, Wilde had begun an affair, a love affair, with Lord Alfred Douglas, one of the younger sons of the Marquis of Queensberry, this incredibly good-looking undergraduate from Magdalen College, Oxford, Wilde's old college. And it was, in a way, a remarkable mutual infatuation, with many echoes of the pederastic ideal of the brilliant elder man and the younger, beautiful beloved. But it was also coloured by a different strain, which was Alfred Douglas's fascination, even despite his youth, with the underworld of Victorian homosexual vice. He was fascinated with the rent boys and young working men who could be paid to have sex with and picked up in the streets of London. And Wilde's relationship with Douglas became, in a way, a mutual investigation of this underworld. Now, Queensberry actually had no knowledge of that hidden side of their life. And he had no great love for his children. Indeed, he was always falling out with them. They heartily detested him because they felt that he treated their mother very badly. He'd divorced her several years before. But Queensberry was a man of sort of extraordinary energy and sort of extraordinary ill temper and extraordinary prejudices. And one of his great prejudices was against homosexuality. He, whatever his dislike for his young son, Alfred Douglas, was, he disliked the idea of him having what seemed to be an improper relationship with that man Wilde, as he referred to him. And he determined to break it up, really through a campaign of public vilification of Wilde. He tried to turn up at the first night of The Importance of Being Earnest and disrupt it with a large bunch of vegetables that he was perhaps going to present to Wilde or throw on the stage, it's unknown. And having been thwarted in that, a few days later he went and took his card and left it at Wilde's club, inscribed to Oscar Wilde. Well, he'd hoped it was saying posing sodomite, but in his intemperate haste, he wrote posing somdomite. Now, Wilde, a few days later, when he collected the card, instead of making a comment on the poor spelling and perhaps throwing it away, felt that here might be at last a moment to actually confront Queensberry and to get him to desist from his attacks. And so he took the card to his solicitor, who said, yes, this constitutes a criminal libel and we can take legal action against Queensberry. And so this unfortunate process was begun, encouraged greatly by Lord Alfred Douglas, who wanted to see his father in the dock, as he said. And Douglas and Wilde were convinced that they would win, that they could prove their point. But unfortunately, the private detectives hired by Queensberry's solicitors got onto the trail of some of these rent boys that they'd been seeing, really by chance. It was an awful concatenation of circumstances. And when Wilde arrived at court, he was presented with this enormous array of evidence against him, which they had been able, Queensberry's team had been able to gather. He stoutly denied it sort of throughout proceedings. But then his fatal desire to say the clever thing, and also to, as always, to relate things to their aesthetic dimension, made that when Edward Carson, who was cross-examining, asked him whether he had ever kissed Walter Granger, he replied, as he did, no, never in my life. He was a peculiarly plain boy. Carson immediately pounced on this and said, so, if he wasn't plain, you would have kissed him. And Wilde sort of attempted to backtrack and to say, no, I was just trying to make a funny point. But Carson repeated and repeated the question and beat down upon him, and Wilde became flustered and was unable to answer. And everyone who was in court that day thought, this was the moment when the tide turned irrevocably against Wilde. And indeed, the next morning, he withdrew from the prosecution, hoping that the matter might be dropped. But unfortunately, all the evidence that had been gathered by Queensberry's legal team was handed over to the Director of Public Prosecutions, and legal proceedings were commenced against Wilde. He was arrested, he was put on trial, he was convicted, he was sentenced to 2 years imprisonment. Which brings us to our last quotation, which is, "I am fighting a battle to the death with my wallpaper. One of us will have to go." Now, this was said at the end of Wilde's life in Paris in a little hotel room in the Rue des Beaux-Arts. He came out of prison after 2 years, in some ways a broken man, but not completely broken. His spirit remained intact, and his genius for language and his gift for art remained unbroken. He was able to confound the system that had treated him so harshly by producing really certainly his most successful book and one of his greatest works, The Ballad of Reading Gaol, which was published the year after he came out of prison. But he felt that, in a way, that was his swan song. The mainspring of his creativity was broken. He was content merely to talk after that. He felt that writing a comedy would be inappropriate. An audience wouldn't be able to understand a man who had gone through what he had gone through, composing a light social comedy. So he began to... he felt he could no longer live in England, so he began an exile on the continent, in France and in Italy, and eventually ending up in Paris, where he happily sat and talked in the cafes to friends, to the writers of the Parisian avant-garde, and to friends who visited him from England. But of course, he was often lonely, he was often sad, but nevertheless, he achieved a certain sort of peace at the end. But his health had been really dealt a severe blow by the appalling conditions of Victorian prison life. And within a couple of years of coming out of prison, a chronic ear infection that he'd had for some time before going into prison reasserted itself and rapidly evolved into meningitis. And so he retreated to his room in the Hotel d'Alsace and entertained his friends with copious champagne, determined, as he said, to die as he had lived beyond his means. And it was on the 30th of November 1900 that he finally lost his battle with the wallpaper. Now, in the obituaries that greeted his death, they were very grudging array of write-ups that he received. The English press felt it was just as well that he had died. And they suggested that his artistic achievements would soon be forgotten. Indeed, it was the Times, I think, that said that really his one line that would live on through the ages was his disappointment with the Atlantic Ocean. But the fact is that 120 years on from that, it is a very happy and remarkable thing that I can be asked to the Pisa Book Festival to talk about Oscar Wilde, and that so many of you can come and listen to it. And I think that happy connection proves how very wrong the critics were. So thank you for helping to prove that.